inheritor of the mantle of radicalism that socialism and Marxism once claimed for itself. It should have something to say about the crises of the day, about the politically relevant issues today. And I'll focus on two in particular. One is the Israel-Palestine conflict, and the second is the rise of the far right. I'll concentrate on the West, on the United States and Europe, but I hope it has some relevance with the continuing and abiding power of the far right, perhaps in this country as well. So I will not dither too long on the internal structure of postcolonial theory, because I've written on this quite a bit, and I have several videos up on YouTube as well, in which I have a more detailed criticism of it. But in order to be fair in one's assessment of it, one does have to, even in this occasion, say something about what its core claims are, and give a brief assessment of those claims, which again will be rather brief, but will rely on, and I hope point you toward the longer critiques that I've made more carefully and more elaborately elsewhere. So we want to know whether postcolonial theory can assess and address the major crises of the day, the two which I have said in particular. We start by asking, well, what is postcolonial theory? What are its main claims? I should start by saying this is always a kind of a fraught task, because the theory is set up to be immune to criticism, because it's so turgid, so impenetrable, so resistant to doing what serious academic does, which is to lay out its arguments carefully so that they might be assessed. The problem is that any time you lay out a criticism, the riposte is, well, you haven't understood us, that's not what the theory says, that's not the important theorist, etc., etc. So it's a risky venture, but I do believe that the two claims I'm going to lay out as being central to its corpus are rather unexceptionable. That is to say, if these claims were not central to postcolonial theory, it's hard to imagine why the theory exists at all. So the first one is a claim that Vivek Chibber says over and over and over again in Provincializing Europe, which is, I think, the sociological core of the theory, which is that capitalism in the 20th century globalized, but it did not universalize. I do not think it's possible to deny that this is a central claim that, of course, that Chakrabarti makes, but which also extends to the rest of the corpus. A second claim, again, which I think is utterly uncontroversial with respect to the corpus, is that all universalizing categories, or what they call master narratives, are to be rejected, or at least should warrant a high degree of skepticism. The reason is that all such master narratives do two things. They occlude and obscure the specificities of local cultures, and hence, by definition, therefore, also of the local culture of colonial societies, which is so different from the West, which is where these categories originate. The second thing they do is they suppress agency. Why do they suppress agency? Because in denying the reality of the lived experience of people in the global South, by denying the salience of the local categories that emerge from their own practice, it denies them the right to understand their practice through their own epistemological categories. And of course, if you deny them their own local knowledge, you're going to deny them the awareness of their situation through which they might be effective agents. Therefore, it suppresses agency. Two claims. One is that capitalism did not universalize itself, and the second is that master narratives and universalization is to be at least very skeptical of, if not rejected. I think this is pretty uncontroversial. All right, so we want to see how these two claims fare when they put under scrutiny. The second thing we want to know is, can a theory that abides by these claims explain and help us engage with the crises of our time? Clear? I usually say interrupt me if you don't understand anything, but actually don't. Interrupt me at the end when there'll be question and answers, because once one interjection comes in, it's like a dam breaking, that everybody wants to say something. So in order to be fair to all the listeners, let's try to hold back until the end. All right, so let's start with these two claims and see if they stand up to critique on their own terms before we go to the political implications. Start with the idea that capitalism has not universalized, even though it's globalized. This is puzzling when you first encounter it. What could it possibly mean? If it's globalized, it means it's spread. If it's spread, it means it's everywhere. And if it's everywhere, it means it's universal. So how can you intuitively, how can you globalize without universalizing? Well, the claim from Chakrabarty appears to be that some elements of capitalism have in fact spread across the world, but the causal properties and the outcome to be associated with it have not. Well, what is the chief such causal property? And I should say, it's not just Chakrabarty who says this, it actually comes from Ranjit Guha. Guha says that when capital left the West, I'm quoting sort of, it abandoned its universalizing vision. What he means by that is capital, when it came to the colonies, did not do the same sorts of things that it did in the West. Two such things in particular, Guha says, it didn't democratize the culture, and the second is it didn't transform social relations as it did in the West. Now, I'm not going to address the issue of democratization in the lecture, although I'm happy to take it up in question and answers, because Guha is fundamentally wrong in the history of bourgeoisie in the West. Let's take up, though, the issue of whether its properties were adequately universalized when it came to the global South. What does Chakrabarty mean by this? He means something very specific, which is that it did not transform all social relations so that they became subordinate to the logic of capital. It did not transform all social relations so that they became subordinate to the logic of capital. Okay, now this is a very specific test for whether or not capitalism is universalized. It means that wherever it goes, every part of the social totality, every part of the social integument should become, in some way or form, subordinate to the logic of capital. But what's the logic of capital? Here, there's no doubt. It is what Marx called the self-valorization of capital. The production of value and the expansion of value as an end in itself. In everyday terms, we would call it the logic of profit maximization. So what capital does when it goes across the world is that it seeks to maximize profits regardless of the culture that it's in. And Chakrabarty is implying that in the drive to maximize profits, it should transform all social relations. And he says, well, look, this hasn't happened. What is the evidence it hasn't happened? There's still a lot of superstition in India. Workers pray while they're working. There's still the salience of religion, etc., etc. Okay, well, of course, this ends up being a test that no country passes, not just India. It's a test that quintessentially bourgeois cultures also fail to pass. You find plenty of superstition in the United States. You find plenty of religiosity in the United States. Same thing in Europe. You find plenty of community organizations, community-oriented consciousness in the West. The problem with Chakrabarty is he puts a test to the universalization of capital that not only no culture can withstand, but which also no Marxist ever said it had. If the universalization of capital means the universalization of profit maximization, then the only social relations capital has to transform in order to fulfill its mission, in order to universalize, is those social relations which stand in the way of profit making. Indeed, in the pursuit of profits, you might find capitalism strengthening certain antediluvian and certain what's called pre-capitalist cultural forms and also social relations. In this goal of maximizing profit, it might amplify religiosity. There's something called the Birla temple. D.D. Birla didn't make this because he ceased to be a capitalist. He made it because he was a capitalist. There's a long history of this. It's so basic, it's so obvious, it doesn't need any kind of stressing. The puzzle is why Chakrabarty would make such an outlandish claim at all. I mean, he never told us why, but he did make the claim. The basic problem with the thesis that capitalism does not universalize is that it proceeds with an exceedingly ambitious and expansive notion of what universalization means. No Marxist, no liberal ever thought that's what it means, that indeed there is no basis